Okay, there's one thing I need to make clear. I'm going to be critiquing Dark Souls 3 for what I consider to be its most egregious faults, but I need to stress the title of the video. This is about why it's a disappointing sequel, not why it's a bad game, okay? I just want to be clear about that. If I didn't like Dark Souls 3, then I wouldn't have spent 300 hours of my finite mortal existence playing it. So I like the game, but I just can't shake this feeling of disappointment all these years later. Dark Souls 3 is a great game, but it's just not special like Dark Souls was. This video is going to be about why I think Dark Souls 3 fails as a sequel, but if you stick around to the end, I'll give it some well-deserved praise as well. So my thesis goes something like this. Dark Souls 3 is a very safe game whose highest ambition is to capture as wide of an audience as possible, while eliminating all consequences from the gameplay in order to not alienate potential new fans. This precedent can be observed across most of the game's mechanics, but I'm going to spend this video pointing out what I think are the most egregious examples of it, so if you'll lend me a little bit of your time, I guess I'll explain why I think that this game that barely anybody talks about anymore was a little bit disappointing in hindsight. Do you remember the Great Hollow from Dark Souls? Just think about how little sense it made. Why would you spend all of that time designing an area and then creating it and implementing it only to lock it behind two illusory walls that most players are going to completely miss? It doesn't make any sense. But I digress. You're probably thinking by now, well, isn't Archdragon Peak kind of like the Great Hollow? I mean, it's pretty well hidden. I probably would not have been able to figure out how to get to it on my first playthrough. And, well, the answer to that is no, absolutely not, because Archdragon Peak is not pure evil. You see that health bar right there? That is called consequences. Consequences for my actions. You see that bonfire right there? I really wonder what led to this outcome. See that weapon right there? Well, I sure hope you brought a repair kit because it's a long way back up. You see this soul right here? Probably no use for it anyway, it's fine. Wow, it sure is nice that all these guys stay put exactly where I need them to. I mean, if they left with their stuff, then I think I'd be in deep trouble.
What spectacular pyromancy? Tell me about it. I have never seen anything like it.
Huh. Laurentius wants to know where I got this pyromancy. Well, I guess there wouldn't be any harm in telling him.
I see. In any case, I definitely trust you. Apologies, my friend. Forget that I said anything.
Whoops, sorry Patches, I think my hand slipped. Well, good thing you're dropping this ash, because then I could just give it to the old lady and we could just let bygones be bygones. Okay, that's enough for the smugness, but I think we can all agree that NPC deaths in Dark Souls 3 just don't really carry any long-term consequences when you can just take their ash and deliver it to the Shrine Maiden, and practically speaking, nothing's changed. I think of all of the things in the game, this has to be the most egregious. I mean, is Rosaria's ghost in the room with me right now? Like, what's going on here? Leonhardt's questline is actually a pretty good microcosm of what I'm talking about here, because we can directly compare it to Lautrec's quest from Dark Souls. As you can see, when Lautrec kills the Firekeeper, the bonfire at Firelink Shrine gets extinguished. This gives the player a very real reason to want to get revenge on Lautrec so you can get back what he essentially stole from you. He's impacted your direct experience with the game negatively. The result is that the game ends up being much more immersive than it would have been if the bonfire had just stayed lit like nothing had happened. This places you very directly in the shoes of your character because now the both of you have a strong motive to want to get revenge on Lautrec. In the case of Dark Souls 3, as you can see, I'm still able to reallocate my attributes and offer Pale Tongues to Rosaria, so it's like nothing changed. I simply have no reason to care about this quest because it hasn't affected me at all. Dark Souls 3 is so afraid of alienating you that it just blatantly defies logic. Why should I be able to do this when I've consumed Rosaria's soul? She's not even around anymore. Now, I'd be remiss to mention that there is one exception to this in Dark Souls 3, and that would be Sirris's quest. But it is really a shame that it is kind of an exception. I would have really loved to have seen more of this kind of thing throughout the game. So, do you regret the Covenant that you chose? Well, it's not a problem. You can just open the menu and switch it out like it's an item. No consequences at all. In Dark Souls 1, if you broke your Covenant, then you would either have to go and pay a pretty large fee for absolution, or you would get invaded by the Blades of the Dark Moon. Now, personally, I wish that they had taken the Covenant system a little bit further in Dark Souls 1. I personally don't believe that the consequences for breaking them were as severe as they should have been. But the solution to this wasn't to just remove all the consequences wholesale. And don't get me started on what these guys can do to you. If you know, you know. I think you should be able to see by now why I have a little bit of a distaste towards Dark Souls 3. Its fixation on convenience, I think, really detracts from what it could have been. This fixation on convenience really does seep into every part of the game, and I think the best example of this probably is the world design. You're probably tired of hearing about this, but I'm going to say it because it's important for this. A linear world is just easier to wrap your head around compared to one that's interwoven and interconnected and complex and sprawling. And when you consider that you also have fast travel available from the start with this linear world, then traversal more or less becomes completely trivial. You can't really get stuck in an area like you can in Dark Souls 1, because From Software correctly surmised that most players probably wouldn't have fun getting to the bottom of an area only to have their weapon break and need to go all the way back up before they can fight the boss to fix it. But here's the thing, you might not find that fun, but the fact that it exists at all means that it's a risk that you have to prepare for. In Dark Souls 1, you're encouraged to prepare for your journeys before you set out on them. That's because if you don't, then things can go pretty bad. But in Dark Souls 3, there really is no journey because it's a computer game, you idiot. I mean, how can it feel like a journey when you can just open a menu and teleport to safety whenever you feel threatened? I'm aware that there are advocates for a linear world design, but I think that their arguments are really weak because they hinge on cherry picking. I mean, think about it. We always hear about how amazing the Cathedral of the Deep is, and to be fair, it's a good level, but we never hear about how bland and forgettable the Road of Sacrifices is, the Smoldering Lake, Demon Ruins, Profane Capital, and even Anor Londo. I mean, at least Dark Souls 1's Anor Londo wasn't a dead end. Most of these areas are just really bland and linear without any real shortcuts. So here's my question to those of you who advocate for a linear world design in these games. Why is it that we can't have complex interwoven levels with connections to other levels? Why are those mutually exclusive? I don't understand. Take a look at this bridge, for example. As you can see, it connects the undead settlement to Farron Keep, and you can also see it from a lot of other points in the game, which I think is really cool. But ask yourself this, if this bridge wasn't broken, would Dark Souls 3 be a worse game? I don't think so. Being able to wander into Farron Keep right at the beginning of the game from the undead settlement is the kind of freedom that I want from these games. I know that it's possible a lot of new players might wander into it in the same way we all wandered into New Londo at the beginning of Dark Souls 1, but I don't want training wheels like that. I want to be able to make mistakes because I like learning from mistakes. Another big problem I have with Dark Souls 3's convenience-first design philosophy is that now there's bonfires around every corner. The most noticeable result of this is that now, in general, the levels have less shortcuts than they used to, because why design a shortcut when you can just place a bonfire down instead? If you look at the footage, then you'll see me running between some bonfires that I think are particularly egregious with this. As you can see, they're very close together. Because of this, Dark Souls 3 in general is a less punishing game than Dark Souls 1 was. Now, I don't think that it's easier entirely because the bosses and enemies are most certainly more challenging in Dark Souls 3, but I think we can all agree that the game is less punishing. This is because if you want to retrieve your bloodstain from the bonfire, then you never have to run very far anymore to do that. Maybe this is just me, but I've noticed that personally I lose my souls far more in 1 than I do in 3, despite having about 200 more hours played in 1 than 3. So that's pretty much it for the video, but I want to spend one last section going over just some random things that I don't like about the game in a more rapid-fire way that aren't necessarily directly related to the thesis of the video. I really don't like how many characters and concepts were reused in Dark Souls 3. I mean, Siegward is basically just Siegmeyer without really any meaningful changes at all, and I would argue that his questline in Dark Souls 3 is weaker than it was in 1. I think in Dark Souls 1, Siegmeyer was kind of an analog to the player in a lot of ways, and how he was seeking adventure and hardship, and how the conclusion to his quest is him going hollow when he's not able to find it, and I think that was really cool. I can't believe they didn't bring back tail cutting from Dark Souls 1. I mean, you don't even necessarily have to have it just be tails, it could be any body part. I mean, it just seems like an easy thing to add, and I'm not really sure why they took it out, it just seems weird. I think it's really disappointing how every boss in Dark Souls 3 is essentially just a normal combat encounter with very little in the way of interesting gimmicks, either in the boss design itself or in the arena. You might think that the Taurus demon in Dark Souls is a forgettable boss, but the fact that his arena was unique to him meant that he felt different from every other encounter in the game, even though he doesn't really have that extensive of a moveset. What I mean by this is that his arena enables you to find different ways of fighting him. For example, you can face him head on, or you can try to get him to fall off the bridge, or you can exploit the plunging attack by going up on the tower. Despite the fact that it is definitely smoother, I think the combat in Dark Souls 3 is probably a bit more shallow than it is in 1. This really comes down to the way poise is handled. In Dark Souls 1, defense and mobility was a legitimate trade-off. It was viable to stack heavy armor and use a shield because of the fact that poise was very powerful. So now that poise has been largely replaced with what is essentially glorified hyper armor, I think that a lot of builds are going to kind of play in a more similar way, where you're pretty much going to be mid-rolling on any build as the optimal strategy for all of them. But I'm not really that adamant about arguing this point in particular because I never went to Dark Souls for the combat personally. I always went to it for the world design, the storytelling, the atmosphere, things like that. If all I felt like doing was swinging a sword around, then I would probably go play one of the Devil May Cry games or something like that. I also found the story in this game to be rather disappointing, although that is kind of a video in its own right. I'm not going to get into that now just because there's too much to say, but I will say that the DLCs were a huge improvement on this front. So if you're a big fan of Dark Souls 3 and you watched to this point, I want to say sincerely, thank you for hearing me out. I really mean that. Now, to prove that I'm not just out here to hate the game or anything like that, I'm going to give the game some praise to balance it out. I will always stand by Artorias of the Abyss being the best of the DLCs in this series because the narrative is it's just perfect, it's impeccable, but I have to admit that just as an overall product, the DLCs in Dark Souls 3 really are the best in the series. I think I even like them more than Shadow of the Erdtree. Outside of one boss in Ashes of Ariandel, all of the DLC bosses really are just perfect, and I think that Sister Frieda, particularly with her use of audio cues when she goes invisible is just masterful stuff. I love it, it's perfect. The fashion souls in Dark Souls 3 really is the best it's ever been. I mean, there's so many cool armor sets, and they look good by themselves, and they look good mixed and matched together, and they've just never achieved this level of style since. And lastly, there's just not really that much to hate about Dark Souls 3. It is a good game. I mean, I think that if I didn't have my expectations set by Dark Souls 1, I think I would have loved it a lot more. There's just not much to dislike about it by itself. Well, now I think that I've finally done enough ranting and raving about this game. I think it's time to throw in the towel for now, but I want to say thank you again if you're watching this and you're seeing this, and feel free to share your thoughts. I'd love to hear them. Thanks. See you.
Dark Souls.